The envelope was cream-colored, expensive. The kind of paper that whispers money before you even open it. I remember standing in my kitchen, holding it, my name written in elegant calligraphy across the front. Ashley Thompson. But when I opened it, the world tilted. Wedding invitation. James Matthew Rodriguez and Madison Claire Blackwell. Request the honor of your presence. James. My James. The man who'd proposed to me with his grandmother's ring just 2 years before. The man who'd broken my heart with a 3-line text message, claiming he'd never really loved me. But the bride wasn't me. It was my stepsister. I stared at that invitation until the letters blurred together, and all I could think was how Madison had always wanted everything I had. My clothes, my friends, my achievements. But this was different. This was calculated. This was war. I had no idea that 7 years later, I'd be the one sending them an invitation they'd never forget. An invitation that would destroy their perfect little world and expose every lie they'd built their marriage on. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began, to the moment my stepmother decided that my happiness was a small price to pay for her daughters. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment letting me know where you're viewing from, and if you're ready for a story about stepfamily manipulation, stolen love, and the kind of revenge that destroys entire empires, hit that subscribe button because what I'm about to tell you will make you question every family dynamic you've ever trusted. My name is Ashley, and until I was 16, I thought I understood what family meant. I lived with my dad in our little 2-bedroom house on Maple Street. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Dad worked construction, came home tired, but always made time to help me with homework at our tiny kitchen table. Then he met Patricia. Patricia Blackwell was everything my late mother wasn't. Where Mom had been warm and genuine, Patricia was polished and calculating. She drove a white BMW, wore clothes that cost more than our monthly rent, and had this way of smiling that never quite reached her eyes. Dad was completely smitten. She's sophisticated, Ashley, he'd say, adjusting his tie in the mirror before their dates. She's going to teach us how to live better. What he meant was that Patricia had money. Lots of it. Her first husband had left her a substantial inheritance, along with a sprawling house in the nicest part of town and a daughter who'd never heard the word no. Madison was 17 when they got married, a year older than me, and she made sure I never forgot it. She had Patricia's ice blue eyes and an attitude that could freeze hell over. Everything about her screamed privilege, from her designer handbags to her convertible Mercedes that she got for her birthday. The day they moved us into Patricia's house, I remember standing in the marble foyer, feeling completely out of place. Madison appeared at the top of the grand staircase, looked down at me with my 2 suitcases and secondhand clothes, and said, "Well, this should be interesting." Patricia wasn't cruel, exactly. She was worse. She was passive-aggressive in a way that made you question your own sanity. "Oh, Ashley, honey," she'd say at dinner, "maybe you could try to eat a little more quietly? Madison has such delicate sensibilities." Or, "Ashley, dear, perhaps you could ask before using the good towels? They're very expensive, and we want to keep them nice for when Madison has friends over." Every comment was a subtle reminder that this wasn't my house, these weren't my things, and I was there on borrowed time. Dad tried to defend me at first, but Patricia had a way of making him feel guilty for every boundary he tried to set. "Richard, honey, I'm not saying Ashley can't use the pool. I'm just suggesting that maybe she could ask first. It's about respect." Within 6 months, Dad stopped defending me altogether. The construction business was struggling, and Patricia's financial support was keeping us afloat. He chose peace over protection, and I learned to fend for myself. I got a job at the local diner, washing dishes after school and on weekends. While Madison was getting her nails done or shopping with Patricia, I was saving every penny for college. I wore thrift store clothes and rode the bus, while Madison complained that her BMW was last year's model. "Ashley, sweetie," Patricia would say when people asked about my work schedule, "is so independent. She insists on working, even though we've told her it's not necessary." The way she said it made it sound like a character flaw. College was my escape. I got a partial scholarship to the state university and worked 3 part-time jobs to cover the rest. For the first time in years, I was somewhere Patricia's influence couldn't reach me. That's where I met James. It was during freshman orientation week. I was sitting alone in the cafeteria, counting the change in my wallet to see if I could afford both lunch and dinner, when someone slid into the seat across from me. "Hey, mind if I sit? Everywhere else is taken." I looked up and saw the most genuinely kind eyes I'd ever encountered. James had this easy smile and dark hair that fell just slightly over his forehead. He was wearing a worn flannel shirt and jeans with a small hole in the knee, clothes that looked lived in, comfortable, real. "Sure," I said, moving my textbooks to make space. "I'm James," he said, unwrapping what looked like a homemade sandwich. "And you look like someone who's doing mental math over a cafeteria menu." I laughed to spite myself. "Is it that obvious?" "Takes one to know one," he said, gesturing to his brown bag lunch. "My mom packs these for me. Says it's more economical than the meal plan." That's how I learned that James came from a family just like mine. His parents owned a small landscaping business that barely broke even. He was at college on a combination of scholarships, loans, and pure determination. He understood what it meant to count every dollar, to work for everything you had, to dream bigger than your circumstances. We started studying together in the library. James was majoring in business with a focus on environmental sustainability. He had big plans to help his family's company grow, to find ways to make eco-friendly landscaping profitable for regular families, not just wealthy clients. "Most people think caring about the environment is a luxury," he told me one night as we shared a bag of discount vending machine chips. "I want to prove them wrong." By sophomore year, we were inseparable. James would walk me to my early morning shifts at the campus bookstore. I'd bring him coffee during his late-night study sessions. We'd split the cost of pizza and dream about the future we'd build together. He met my family during spring break junior year. I was nervous about bringing him home, knowing Patricia would judge his worn jeans and 10-year-old pickup truck. I was right. "So, James," Patricia said over dinner, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "what are your career prospects after graduation?" "I'm planning to expand my family's business," James replied politely. "We're looking into sustainable landscaping solutions for residential communities." Patricia exchanged a look with Madison. "How ambitious," she said in a tone that made it clear she thought it was anything but. Madison barely acknowledged James that first visit. She was dating some guy from her private college at the time, someone whose family owned a chain of restaurants. She had no interest in my little college boyfriend, as she called him behind my back. But James won Dad over immediately. He asked thoughtful questions about construction work, complimented the craftsmanship in Patricia's house, and offered to help fix a loose porch step. By the end of the weekend, Dad was showing him around the garage like they were old friends. "I like him," Dad told me privately. "He's got a good head on his shoulders and he treats you right." It was one of the few times during those years that I felt Dad was truly on my side. Senior year, James proposed. It wasn't elaborate or expensive. He took me to the campus arboretum where we'd had our first official date, got down on one knee by the pond where we'd fed ducks with stale bread from the cafeteria. The ring had belonged to his grandmother, a simple solitaire with a small but beautiful diamond. It wasn't flashy, but it was perfect. It was real. "Ashley," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "you're the strongest, most genuine person I know. You've shown me what it means to work for something and appreciate it. Will you marry me?" I said yes before he'd even finished the question. We called our families that night. Dad was thrilled, genuinely happy for me in a way I hadn't seen in years. Patricia congratulated us with her usual detached politeness, but I could hear something else in her voice. Calculation. Like she was already running numbers in her head. The change in Patricia was subtle at first. Suddenly, she was interested in our wedding plans. She offered to help with the guest list, suggested venues, even mentioned contributing to the costs. "Of course, we want to make sure Ashley has a beautiful wedding," she'd say to anyone who'd listen. After all, she's family. But there were conditions attached to every offer. The venue she suggested was booked solid for the next 2 years. The caterer she recommended was 3 times our budget. Every helpful suggestion seemed designed to highlight how limited our resources were. More concerning was her sudden interest in James. "Why don't you invite James for dinner this Sunday?" she'd ask me. I'd love to get to know him better. These dinners became a regular thing. Patricia would cook elaborate meals, set the dining room table with her finest china, and spend the evening asking James pointed questions about his future plans. "Have you thought about expanding beyond landscaping?" she'd ask. "There's so much money in real estate development these days. What about your business degree? Surely you could do better than working with plants all day." James would answer politely, but I could see he was uncomfortable. After one particularly intense dinner, he pulled me aside. "Ashley, is it just me, or does your stepmother seem like she's interviewing me for a job?" I laughed it off, but privately, I was starting to worry too. Things got stranger when Patricia began inviting James to family events without me. Madison's birthday dinner at the country club. A charity auction Patricia was organizing. Girls' events, she'd explain when I asked why I wasn't included. "Boys need to bond too," she'd say with that fake smile. "James should get to know Richard better. After all, he'll be family soon." But it wasn't Dad that James was spending time with. It was Madison. The first time I noticed them talking privately, I was coming back from the kitchen with drinks. They were standing close together on the patio, Madison's hand on James's arm, both of them speaking in low, urgent voices. When they saw me, they jumped apart like they'd been caught doing something wrong. "Just telling James about my new business venture," Madison said quickly. "Nothing you'd be interested in." But something about her expression made my stomach turn. Madison had graduated from her expensive private college with a degree in marketing that Patricia had paid for in full. She'd launched what she called a lifestyle consulting business, though as far as I could tell, it mostly involved posting inspirational quotes on social media and selling overpriced journals to women who wanted to optimize their potential. The business was funded entirely by Patricia, who'd set Madison up with a sleek office downtown and enough capital to hire professional photographers for her Instagram content. Madison treated it like playing dress-up, but she made good money because Patricia's connections kept sending clients her way. "Madison is such an entrepreneur," Patricia would brag to anyone who'd listen. "She's already making 6 figures in her first year." What Patricia didn't mention was that Madison's 6-figure income came almost entirely from Patricia's network of wealthy friends who were essentially paying Madison to be their decorator and party planner. James started canceling our dates more frequently. "Family dinner," he'd say apologetically. "Patricia invited me again, and I don't want to be rude." Or, "Madison wanted to show me her new office. It'll just be a quick stop." I tried to be understanding. I knew how persuasive Patricia could be, and I didn't want to come across as controlling or jealous. But every canceled date felt like a small betrayal. The worst part was that James seemed to be enjoying the attention. For someone who'd grown up with limited means, Patricia's world of country clubs and networking events was seductive. I watched him buy new clothes for these family gatherings, saw him starting to use words like leveraging opportunities and strategic partnerships. He was still loving and attentive when we were alone, but there was a new distance between us. Like part of his mind was always somewhere else. If you've ever felt like someone was plotting against your happiness, smash that subscribe button, because this story is about to get much worse before it gets better. And trust me, the revenge is worth waiting for. I should have seen it coming. Looking back, all the signs were there. But love makes you stupid and hope makes you blind. James's family business had been struggling for months. His father had made some bad investments, trying to expand too quickly without enough capital. They'd taken out loans they couldn't afford, and the economy was making it harder to find new clients. I knew James was worried, but he tried to hide it from me. "Dad's got it under control," he'd say when I asked. But I could see the stress in his face, the way he'd stare at his phone during our conversations, the way he'd grown distant and distracted. What I didn't know was that Patricia had found out about their financial troubles. She had a gift for discovering people's vulnerabilities. She knew which contractors Dad worked with were behind on their taxes, which of Madison's friends had parents going through messy divorces, which families in her social circle were living beyond their means. Information was currency to Patricia, and she collected it like some people collected stamps. Somehow, she'd learned that James's family was 3 months behind on their loan payments. The bank was threatening foreclosure. They were going to lose everything, the business, their house, their entire livelihood. And Patricia saw an opportunity. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at work, pulling a double shift at the campus bookstore. James was supposed to pick me up at 7, but at 6:30, he called to cancel. Something came up with my family, he said, his voice strained. Can you get a ride home? I could hear background noise, classical music, the sound of expensive glassware clinking. He was at Patricia's house. Is everything okay? I asked. Yeah, just business stuff. I'll call you later tonight. But he didn't call. Not that night, not the next day. When I finally reached him, he sounded like a completely different person. Ashley, we need to talk. We met at our usual spot in the Arboretum, but instead of sitting on our favorite bench, James stood with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, avoiding eye contact. I've been thinking about us, he began, and my heart immediately started racing. About our future, about what we both want. Okay, I said carefully. What about it? I think we're too young to get married. I think we're making a mistake. The words hit me like a physical blow. What are you talking about? James, we've been planning this for months. We're supposed to look at Benny's this weekend. I know, but... He finally looked at me, and there was something hollow in his eyes. I don't think I'm ready for this kind of commitment. I don't think we're right for each other. Are you serious right now? My voice was getting louder. Where's this coming from? I've been thinking about it for a while, he said, but the words sounded rehearsed. We want different things. You're focused on your career, and I need to focus on helping my family. I can help with your family. James, we're supposed to be a team. No, he said firmly. This is something I need to handle on my own. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of the man I'd fallen in love with. Is this about Patricia? Has she been putting ideas in your head? Something flickered across his expression, guilt, maybe, or fear. This has nothing to do with Patricia. This is about us. Then look me in the eye and tell me you don't love me anymore. For a moment, he hesitated. For a moment, I thought I saw the real James fighting to surface. But then his expression hardened again. I don't love you anymore, Ashley. I'm sorry. The ring, his grandmother's ring, was sitting on the bench between us before I even realized I'd taken it off. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely coordinate the movement. If that's how you feel, I whispered, then I guess we're done. I walked away without looking back, leaving him standing there in the place where he'd proposed just 6 months earlier. That night, I cried until I couldn't breathe. Dad tried to comfort me, but Patricia kept making comments about how these things happen and it's better to find out now than after the wedding. 3 days later, Madison came to my room. She knocked softly and waited for permission to enter, which was unusual for her. Normally, she just barged in like she owned the place. Ashley, she said, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. I wanted to return this to you. She held out a small velvet box. James's grandmother's ring. He asked me to give it back, she said. He thought it would be easier than seeing you again. I took the box with numb fingers. How do you know James? We've been talking, Madison said, sitting on the edge of my bed without invitation. He's been really struggling with this decision. He cares about you, Ashley, but sometimes caring isn't enough. There was something in her voice, something almost triumphant, that made me look at her more closely. She was wearing makeup even though it was almost bedtime, and her hair was styled like she'd been somewhere important. Madison, I said slowly, where were you tonight? Just out with friends, she said quickly. Why? But I could smell his cologne on her. The same scent I'd been smelling on James for weeks, the expensive cologne that Patricia had bought him as a graduation gift. Get out of my room, I said quietly. Ashley, I was just trying to. Get out. She left quickly, but I could hear her on the phone in the hallway, speaking in hushed, excited tones. I didn't know it then, but Patricia had given James an ultimatum. Marry Madison and receive enough money to save his family's business, or watch his parents lose everything. She'd presented it as a business proposition, a merger of families that would benefit everyone involved. Ashley will understand eventually, Patricia had told him. She's young. She'll find someone else. But your family only has one chance to survive, and I'm offering it to you. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. The next few weeks were a blur of humiliation and heartbreak. James stopped answering my calls completely. I'd see his truck around town, but he'd take different routes to avoid places where we might run into each other. The worst part was that everyone seemed to know something I didn't. I'd catch classmates whispering when I walked by, see them exchange meaningful looks when James's name came up in conversation. Patricia was suddenly very concerned about my emotional well-being. "Oh, honey," she'd say, appearing with cups of tea and sympathetic looks, "I know this is hard. But you're so young. You have your whole life ahead of you. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise," she'd add. "Now you can focus on your studies without distractions." Dad was genuinely upset for me, but he was also clearly relieved that he wouldn't have to pay for a wedding he couldn't afford. Patricia had been making comments about proper weddings and family expectations that had been keeping him up at night. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he'd say, awkwardly patting my shoulder. "But maybe it's for the best. You're too good for him anyway." Madison, meanwhile, had become mysteriously busy. She was always running errands or meeting with clients, but I'd see her car parked in weird places around town. Once, I swear I saw James's truck following her BMW down Main Street, but when I looked again, it was gone. 2 weeks after the breakup, I was grocery shopping when I ran into James's mother, Maria. She looked awful, tired and stressed, with the kind of exhaustion that comes from months of sleepless nights. "Ashley," she said, her eyes immediately filling with tears. "Mija, I'm so sorry." "Mrs. Rodriguez," I said, my voice catching. "How are you doing?" She looked around nervously, like she was afraid someone might be watching. "Can we talk? Privately?" We ended up sitting in her car in the grocery store parking lot while she told me what had really happened. "James didn't want to break up with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That woman, Patricia, she came to our house. She knew about our debts, about the foreclosure. She said she could help, but only if James—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Only if James what?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "If he married her daughter instead." She said it was a business arrangement, that Madison needed a husband and James needed money. She said you were too young anyway, that you'd get over it. The world tilted around me. Everything suddenly made horrible, perfect sense. "How much money?" I asked. "Enough to save everything. The business, the house, all of it. She wired the first payment the day James broke up with you. The rest comes when he marries Madison." I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. "I told him not to do it," Maria continued, tears streaming down her face. "I told him we'd find another way, that we could sell the house, start over somewhere else. But his father said we couldn't turn down this opportunity. He said it was the only way to save 3 generations of work." "Where is James now?" I asked. "Planning the wedding," she said bitterly. "Patricia has everything arranged. It's in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. They were getting married in 6 weeks." "Mrs. Rodriguez," I said carefully, "does James know that I know?" She shook her head. "Patricia made us promise not to tell anyone. She said if word got out about the arrangement, the deal was off and we'd lose everything anyway." That's when I realized the full scope of Patricia's manipulation. She hadn't just destroyed my relationship. She'd trapped James in a marriage he didn't want and forced his family to participate in the lie. But there was nothing I could do. If I confronted James, he'd lose the money and his family would be ruined. If I told Dad, Patricia would deny everything and James's family would still be destroyed. She'd planned it perfectly. I went home that night and told Dad I was transferring to a different school for my final semester. "I need a fresh start," I said. "Somewhere James and I won't accidentally run into each other." Dad was reluctant, but Patricia immediately supported the idea. "I think that's very mature of you, Ashley," she said. "Sometimes a change of scenery is exactly what we need." She even offered to help with the transfer costs, which should have been my first clue that she wanted me gone. I know some of you are probably screaming at your screens right now. I was screaming too. Hit that notification bell because you need to see how this story ends. Justice is coming. I finished my degree at a small college 3 hours away, living in a tiny apartment and working at a local restaurant to pay the bills. It was supposed to be my escape, but you can't run away from heartbreak. Every morning, I woke up expecting a text from James that never came. Every evening, I fought the urge to drive back home and tell him I knew the truth. But his family's survival depended on my silence, and I couldn't bring myself to be the reason they lost everything. The wedding announcement appeared in the local newspaper 6 weeks later, just like Maria had predicted. The photo showed James in a perfectly tailored tuxedo standing next to Madison in an elaborate white gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. They looked like the perfect couple. James was smiling, but if you knew him the way I did, you could see that it didn't reach his eyes. Madison was radiant, practically glowing with triumph. The article described it as the social event of the season. 300 guests, reception at the country club, honeymoon in Europe. Everything I'd dreamed of having but could never afford. Patricia was quoted extensively about how thrilled she was to welcome James into the family, how Madison had always known he was the one, how they were perfectly suited for each other. The lies were so smooth, so confident, that anyone reading the article would believe this was a genuine love story. I cut out the announcement and kept it in my desk drawer, torturing myself by reading it over and over. Some nights, I'd stare at that photo until I'd memorized every detail, the way James's hand rested on Madison's waist, the expensive flowers in her bouquet, the satisfied smirk on Patricia's face in the background. Friends from my old school would occasionally update me on the newlyweds. They'd moved into a beautiful house on the other side of town, paid for by Patricia as a wedding gift. James had left his family's struggling landscaping business to work for one of Patricia's wealthy friends, managing investments and real estate deals. He's doing really well for himself, one friend told me over the phone. Madison's been posting all these photos of their fancy dinners and weekend trips. They look really happy. But Maria Rodriguez told a different story when she called me a few months after the wedding. He's miserable, she whispered into the phone. He calls me sometimes, late at night when Madison's asleep. He asks about you. He wants to know if you're okay, if you've met someone else. What do you tell him? I asked. I tell him you're strong, that you're building a good life for yourself. But Ashley, he's drowning. This isn't the life he wanted. There's nothing I can do, I said, and we both knew it was true. The calls from Maria became less frequent as time passed. James's family had stabilized financially, but the cost was their son's happiness. They'd made their choice, and now they all had to live with it. I threw myself into my studies and graduated with honors. Without the distraction of wedding planning and the emotional support of a relationship I'd thought would last forever, I'd focused entirely on my academic work. For the first time in my life, I was completely on my own. No family support, no boyfriend to lean on, no safety net except my own determination. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. I decided not to go home for graduation. Dad wanted to come to the ceremony, but Patricia convinced him it would be too emotional for everyone involved. Let Ashley have her space, she said. She'll come around when she's ready. But I wasn't planning to come around. I was planning to disappear. I'd been accepted to graduate school at a university in Colorado, as far from home as I could get while still staying in the United States. I packed everything I owned into my beat-up Honda Civic and drove west without telling anyone where I was going. For the first time in years, I felt free. Colorado was a revelation. Nobody knew my history. Nobody pitted me for my failed engagement. Nobody compared me to Madison or treated me like Patricia's charity case. I was just Ashley, smart, hardworking, determined to build something meaningful with my life. I rented a studio apartment near campus and got a job managing social media for local businesses. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well and gave me flexibility to attend classes and build my own client base on the side. Slowly, carefully, I began to construct a new version of myself. I made friends who knew nothing about my past. I dated occasionally, though I wasn't ready for anything serious. I focused on my master's degree in business administration and dreamed about starting my own company someday. The pain of losing James never completely went away, but it evolved into something else. Anger. Determination. A burning desire to prove that Patricia had underestimated me. I wanted to show them all that I was more than just the girl who got left behind. Graduate school transformed me in ways I hadn't expected. Being surrounded by ambitious, driven people who were focused on building businesses and changing industries made me realize how small my previous world had been. I specialized in digital marketing and business development, learning everything I could about how companies grew from nothing into major players in their fields. My professors noticed my work ethic and started recommending me for competitive internships. The summer between my first and second year, I worked for a consulting firm that helped small businesses scale their operations. It was exactly the kind of work I'd dreamed of doing, using strategy and creativity to solve real problems for real people. My supervisor, Janet, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd built her own company from scratch before selling it and moving into consulting. "You have good instincts," she told me after a particularly successful client presentation. "But more importantly, you understand that business isn't just about numbers. It's about people." She offered me a full-time position after graduation, but I had bigger plans. "I want to start my own firm," I told her during our final meeting. "Good," she said without hesitation. "You're ready for it. And when you need your first major client, call me." I graduated at the top of my class and immediately moved to Denver, where the business scene was thriving but not yet oversaturated. I used every penny of my savings to rent a small office space and buy basic equipment. Thompson Consulting was born on a Tuesday morning in September, with nothing but a business license, a laptop, and an unshakable belief that I could help companies grow smarter, not just bigger. My first client was a family-owned restaurant that was struggling to compete with chain establishments. Within 6 months, I'd helped them develop a social media strategy and local marketing campaign that doubled their revenue. Word spread quickly in Denver's tight-knit business community. I worked 18-hour days, taking on projects that larger consulting firms considered too small or too risky. But those small projects taught me everything about how real businesses operated, and my success rate was nearly perfect. By the end of my second year, I had 12 employees and a waiting list of potential clients. More importantly, I was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy in a way I hadn't been since before James broke my heart. I was building something that was entirely mine, proving to myself that I didn't need anyone else's approval or support to succeed. That's when I met David. He was the owner of a tech startup that had hired my firm to help with their expansion strategy. Our first meeting was supposed to last an hour. We talked for 4. David was nothing like James. Where James had been earnest and hardworking, but ultimately weak when it mattered, David was confident and decisive. He'd built his company from an idea he developed in his garage into a profitable business with offices in 3 states. But what drew me to him wasn't his success, it was his integrity. During our second meeting, he mentioned that one of his competitors had offered him insider information about a major contract, and he'd turned it down. "I'd rather lose honestly than win by cheating," he said simply. After 6 months of working together professionally, he asked me out for dinner. Not a business dinner, but a real date. "I know this might be complicated," he said, "since we work together. But I'd regret it forever if I didn't ask." I said yes. David's family had money, not flashy, inherited wealth like Patricia's, but the kind of generational success that came from building businesses and investing wisely. His parents were warm, genuine people who'd raised their children to be humble despite their advantages. The first time he took me home to meet them, I was nervous about being judged. Instead, his mother spent the evening asking thoughtful questions about my business and sharing stories about her own career as a pediatric nurse. "David's never brought home anyone like you," his father told me privately. "Usually, he dates women who are more interested in what he can give them than who he actually is." Dating David felt easy in a way that my relationship with James never had. There were no hidden agendas, no family manipulations, no financial pressures complicating every decision. We were both successful adults choosing to build a life together because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. 2 years into our relationship, Thompson Consulting had grown into one of Denver's most respected business development firms. I had 43 employees, offices in Denver and Colorado Springs, and clients across the western United States. I also had something I'd never possessed before: real financial security. Not Patricia's kind of conditional, manipulative wealth, but money I'd earned myself and could spend however I chose. That's when I started thinking about home. Subscribe to Revenge with Nick if you love seeing underdogs rise up, because what happens next is absolutely savage. I hadn't spoken to my family in almost 5 years when Dad called me on a Tuesday evening in March. Ashley? His voice sounded older, more fragile than I remembered. Honey, I know it's been a long time. Hi, Dad, I said, surprised by how emotional I felt hearing his voice. Is everything okay? I'm fine, but, well, things have been complicated here. I wanted to hear your voice, to know you're doing well. We talked for an hour. He told me about his work, his health, the changes in our hometown. He was careful not to mention Patricia or Madison directly, but I could read between the lines. How's the family? I finally asked. There was a long pause. Patricia's having some financial difficulties, he said carefully. Turns out some of her investments weren't as solid as she thought. What kind of difficulties? The kind where we might need to sell the house, he admitted. Her first husband's money, well, it's mostly gone. This was interesting news, but I was more curious about James and Madison. What about the newlyweds? Another pause. They're struggling. James's business ventures haven't worked out the way Patricia promised. And Madison's company is having problems. After we hung up, I did something I hadn't done in years. I looked up Madison's social media accounts. Her Instagram, which had once been full of carefully curated photos of expensive dinners and luxury vacations, had become noticeably less lavish. The posts were less frequent, the locations less impressive. Instead of designer handbags and first-class flight photos, she was posting inspirational quotes about authentic living and finding joy in simple moments. James's social media presence was minimal, but I could see him tagged in some of Madison's photos. He looked older, tired, and in several pictures, he wasn't smiling at all. Curious, I used my business connections to do some research on their financial situation. What I discovered was fascinating. Patricia's help for James's family had come with strings attached. She hadn't simply paid off their debts. She'd restructured them as loans from her personal accounts, with James's family business as collateral. She'd been charging them interest. For 5 years, James's parents had been making payments to Patricia, believing they were paying down their debt. But the terms of the loan were structured so that they were barely covering the interest. The principal amount had actually grown. Meanwhile, the lucrative business opportunities Patricia had promised James had all been controlled by her network of friends. James was essentially a well-paid employee, dependent on Patricia's connections for his income. If he ever crossed her, if his marriage to Madison ever failed, he'd lose everything. Madison's business was similarly dependent on Patricia's financial support. The office, the equipment, the initial client base, all of it had been provided by Patricia, who had structured everything as loans rather than gifts. On paper, Madison owed her mother nearly $200,000. It was a masterpiece of financial manipulation. Patricia had created a system where everyone in her orbit was completely dependent on her continued support, but she retained all the power to cut them off at any time. The beautiful house where James and Madison lived, owned by Patricia, who charged them rent that was just slightly below market rate, enough to feel generous, but still profitable for her. James's salary from his job managing investments? Those investments belonged to Patricia's friends, who could fire him on a whim if Patricia requested it. Even their marriage was built on financial quicksand. If they divorced, James would lose his job, his house, and his family's business would be foreclosed on immediately. Patricia had trapped them all in golden handcuffs. But the most interesting discovery was that Patricia's own financial situation was far more precarious than anyone realized. Her first husband's inheritance had been substantial, but not infinite. Patricia had been living above her means for years, using credit and leveraging assets to maintain her lifestyle. The loans she'd made to James's family and Madison weren't acts of generosity. They were attempts to generate income from her remaining capital. She was, in essence, running a small-scale financial empire built on manipulation and control. But empires fall, especially when they're built on lies. That's when Maria Rodriguez called me. Ashley, she said, her voice shaking, I know I shouldn't be calling you, but I don't know who else to talk to. What's wrong? It's Patricia. She's been calling our house, demanding larger payments. She says the loan terms have changed, that we owe more than we thought. James is working 16-hour days trying to make enough money to keep up. How much more? Double. She wants double what we've been paying, starting next month. She says if we can't pay, she'll take the business and the house. I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar anger building in my chest. Maria, I said carefully, do you have copies of the original loan documents? James has them. But Ashley, we can't, if Patricia finds out we're talking to you. She won't find out from me, I promised. But I might be able to help. Can you get me copies of those documents? Why would you help us? After everything that happened. I thought about that question for a long moment. Because what Patricia did to all of us was wrong, I said finally. And because I'm in a position to do something about it now. The documents arrived by overnight mail 3 days later. I spent the weekend reviewing them with a lawyer friend of mine who specialized in predatory lending practices. This is some of the most manipulative financial structuring I've ever seen, he told me. It's technically legal, but barely. And there are a few clauses here that might be enforceable. What kind of clauses? The kind that might let you challenge the entire arrangement if you had enough capital to make it worthwhile. I smiled for the first time in days. How much capital would we need? Planning my wedding to David was nothing like planning my wedding to James had been. Where that process had been stressful and financial complicated, this was pure joy. David and I were both successful adults with our own money and clear ideas about what we wanted. We chose a beautiful venue in the mountains outside Denver, hired photographers we actually liked instead of whoever was cheapest, and invited everyone who mattered to us. But there was one detail I insisted on that puzzled David at first. You want to have the reception at the Grandview Country Club? He asked, looking at the venue information I'd handed him. In your hometown? Trust me, I said. It's perfect. The Grandview Country Club was where Madison and James had held their receptions 7 years earlier. It was also where Patricia hosted all her important social events, where she'd built her reputation as one of the town's most influential women. It was where everyone who mattered in Patricia's world would see me, would see what I'd become, would realize that the girl they'd written off had built an empire of her own. I hired the same wedding planner Patricia had used for Madison's wedding. I booked the same photographer, the same florist, even the same caterer. But where Madison's wedding had been elegant and traditional, mine was going to be spectacular and modern. David's family contributed generously to the wedding budget, not because we needed the money, but because they genuinely wanted to celebrate our marriage. The difference between their enthusiastic support and Patricia's manipulative help was stark. 3 months before the wedding, I started sending out save the dates. Patricia, Richard, and Madison were all included. But I didn't mail them. I hand-delivered them. I flew back to my hometown on a Friday afternoon and rented a car at the airport. 7 years away had given me perspective on how small and insular the place really was. The same strip malls, the same local restaurants, the same social hierarchies that had seemed so important when I was younger. Patricia's house looked exactly the same from the outside, but I could see signs of financial strain if you knew what to look for. The landscaping was less manicured, the driveway needed repair, and there was a for sale sign in front of the house next door that suggested property values in the neighborhood weren't what they used to be. I rang the doorbell at exactly 2 p.m. on Saturday afternoon. Patricia answered the door, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. She looked older, and I could see signs of stress in the lines around her eyes that expensive creams couldn't completely hide. But what struck me most was that she looked uncertain, almost nervous. "Ashley," she said finally. "What are you doing here?" "Hello, Patricia. I brought you something." I handed her the cream-colored envelope with her name written in elegant calligraphy. She opened it with shaking hands. "You're getting married," she said, staring at the invitation. "I am. To a wonderful man who actually loves me." "Ashley," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "This is unexpected. Hello, Patricia. I hope you can all attend. It's going to be quite an event." I watched her eyes scan the invitation, taking in the venue, the date, the expensive paper, and professional calligraphy. I watched her do the mental math, calculating what a wedding like this would cost. The Grandview Country Club, she said slowly. That's ambitious. David's family has been members there for 30 years, I said casually. His father is on the board of directors. That got her attention. Patricia knew everyone who mattered at the country club, and she definitely knew David's father by reputation. He was exactly the kind of man she'd always wanted to associate with: old money, real power, genuine influence. How wonderful for you, she said, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. Where's Dad? I asked. At work, she said quickly. He's working weekends now. Construction work on weekends usually meant financial pressure. Things were worse than I'd thought. I left almost immediately. The drive to James's parents' house took 15 minutes through neighborhoods that had seen better days. The Rodriguez family home looked smaller than I remembered, but it was well-maintained and welcoming. Maria answered the door and immediately burst into tears. Ashley, Mija, look at you. She pulled me into a hug that felt like coming home. Over her shoulder, I could see James's father, Carlos, standing in the living room with the expression of surprise and guilt. We didn't know you were coming, Maria said, wiping her eyes. James isn't here, he's at work, but... I know, I said gently. I didn't come to see James. I came to see you. We sat in their living room for 2 hours while I explained what I'd discovered about Patricia's loan arrangements and what I was prepared to do about it. You would do this for us? Carlos asked, his voice thick with emotion. After everything that happened? Mr. Rodriguez, I said, what happened to James and me wasn't your fault. Patricia manipulated all of us. But I'm in a position to fix this now and I want to help. I handed Maria a business card for my lawyer friend in Colorado. Call him next week. He's going to help you restructure this debt situation. And Carlos? You might want to start documenting every conversation you have with Patricia from now on. As I was leaving, Maria grabbed my hand. Ashley, she said, James still asks about you. He's not happy, Mija. This marriage, it's killing him slowly. I know, I said. But he made his choice. Now I'm making mine. The final stop was James and Madison's house, a beautiful colonial in an expensive subdivision that I knew Patricia owned. James answered the door. For a moment, we just stared at each other. He looked exactly like I remembered, but somehow completely different. Older, yes, but more than that. There was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a resignation that made my heart ache despite everything. Ashley, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hello, James. He glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to see if Madison was home, then stepped outside and closed the door behind him. What are you doing here? I handed him the invitation. He opened it slowly, reading every word twice. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. You're happy? He asked. Very happy. Good, he said, and I could tell he meant it. I'm glad. James, I said gently, you know this doesn't have to be forever, right? The situation you're in with Patricia, with the loans, with everything, there are ways out. He shook his head. There's too much at stake. My parents, the business, everything. If I mess this up, what if someone else handled the debt? What if your family was free to make their own choices? He looked at me sharply. What are you talking about? I'm talking about options, James. I'm talking about freedom. Before he could respond, I heard footsteps inside the house. I should go, I said. But James? Think about what I said. Sometimes the cage door is unlocked, and we just don't realize it. I walked back to my rental car without looking back, but I could feel him watching me drive away. If you're living for this level of petty revenge, you need to subscribe to Revenge with Nick, because the final twist will leave you speechless. My wedding day was perfect. The weather was beautiful, the venue was stunning, and David looked at me like I was the most important person in his universe. But the best part was watching Patricia's face when she realized what she was dealing with. David's family didn't just have money, they had the kind of generational wealth and social connections that made Patricia's status look like amateur hour. His parents arrived with a security detail and a guest list that included senators, federal judges, and Fortune 500 CEOs. The wedding was featured in 3 different society magazines and attended by people whose names appeared regularly in the business section of major newspapers. Patricia, who was used to being the most important person at any social event, found herself completely outclassed. She spent the entire reception trying to network with David's family and friends, only to discover that they already knew exactly who she was and what she'd done to me. David's mother, Janet, was particularly devastating. "Oh, you must be Ashley's stepmother," she said when Patricia introduced herself. "Ashley's told us so much about you." The way she said it made it clear that everything Ashley had told them was not complimentary. But the real showstopper came during my maid of honor speech. My maid of honor was my business partner and best friend, Rebecca, who knew the entire story of what had happened with James and Madison. She stood up with a glass of champagne and a smile that could have cut glass. "I've known Ashley for 4 years," she began, "and in that time, I've watched her build an incredible business and an incredible life. But what I admire most about Ashley is her ability to turn betrayal into motivation." She paused, looking directly at the table where Patricia, Dad, Madison, and James sat together in uncomfortable silence. "They say success is the best revenge, but I think Ashley proves that sometimes success is also the best form of justice." The applause was thunderous, but I was watching Dad's face. He looked proud but also deeply sad, like he was finally understanding what his choices had cost him. Patricia, meanwhile, had gone completely white. After the speeches, I made my rounds to thank the guests. When I reached my family's table, Dad stood up immediately. "Ashley," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm so proud of you. I know I haven't always. I should have." "Dad," I said gently, giving him a hug, "you're here now. That's what matters." I could see tears in his eyes as he squeezed me tight. "I've missed you so much, sweetheart." After a moment with Dad, I sat down in the empty chair next to Patricia. "Thank you for coming," I said sweetly. "I know it means a lot to David's family to meet mine." "Ashley," Patricia said quietly, "this is quite an impressive event, isn't it?" David's parents insisted on handling most of the arrangements. They said they wanted to make sure their son's wedding was appropriately celebrated. I could see her doing the math, calculating the cost of everything she was seeing. "You've done very well for yourself," she said finally. "I have. And speaking of doing well, I have some good news to share with you." I pulled out a legal document and placed it on the table in front of her. "I've purchased the Rodriguez family's debt from you. All of it. They're now free and clear." Patricia's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, anger, and finally, fear. "You can't do that," she said. "Actually, I can. And I have. Your loan agreement included a clause allowing the debt to be sold to a third party. Carlos and Maria signed the transfer documents this morning." "How much did you pay?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Does it matter? The point is, they're free now. James is free. They can make their own choices about their future without worrying about your financial manipulation." Patricia stared at the document like it might burst into flames. "But that's not the best part," I continued. "The best part is that I also bought Madison's business debt, and the mortgage on your house, and the note on James and Madison's house." Now Patricia looked like she might faint. "You see, Patricia, when you've built your entire empire on leveraging other people's desperation, you become vulnerable to someone with more capital and fewer scruples. Someone like me." "What do you want?" she whispered. "I want you to understand that actions have consequences. For 7 years, you've controlled people through debt and manipulation. Now you get to see what it feels like to have someone else hold your future in their hands." I stood up and smoothed my wedding dress. "But don't worry. I'm not you. I'm not going to destroy people's lives for my own entertainment. James and Madison's mortgage is forgiven. Madison's business debt is forgiven. And as for your house..." I paused for dramatic effect. "Well, let's just say you have 6 months to figure out your financial situation. After that, we'll need to discuss payment arrangements." I walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Patricia at the table with the legal documents spread out in front of her. The wedding continued late into the night, but Patricia's family left early. I watched through the window as they walked to their car, Patricia leaning heavily on Richard's arm while Madison and James followed in silence. 3 months later, Patricia and Richard moved out of the mansion and into a modest rental house across town. The official story was that they were downsizing and simplifying their lives, but everyone knew the truth. Madison's lifestyle consulting business closed quietly. Without Patricia's financial backing and network connections, there simply weren't enough clients to keep it viable. James divorced Madison 6 months after my wedding. With his family's debt eliminated and no financial pressure to maintain the marriage, he was finally free to make his own choices. He sent me a letter after the divorce was finalized, but I didn't read it. David and I were building our own life together, and the past needed to stay in the past. Patricia tried to contact me several times over the next year, but I had my assistant handle all communication. The house was eventually sold to cover her debts, and she and Richard moved to a small apartment in a neighboring town. As for Madison, I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved back in with her mother and was working as a receptionist at a dental office. It wasn't the life she'd expected, but it was honest work. The last I heard about James, he'd moved back to Colorado and was working for an environmental consulting firm. His parents had rebuilt their landscaping business and were doing better than ever. And that's how you turn betrayal into the best thing that ever happened to you. If this story fired you up, subscribe to Revenge with Nick for more stories of justice served cold. Drop a comment telling me, was my revenge too harsh or not harsh enough? See you in the next one. People sometimes ask me if I feel guilty about what happened to Patricia and Madison. The honest answer is no. I didn't destroy their lives. I simply stopped allowing them to destroy other people's lives. Every choice they made after that was their own responsibility. Patricia taught me that family isn't about blood or marriage certificates. It's about people who genuinely care about your well-being and want to see you succeed. David's family welcomed me with open arms, never once making me feel like I had to earn their acceptance. My business continued to grow, and 5 years after the wedding, Thompson Consulting was acquired by a national firm for more money than I'd ever imagined having. David and I used our combined resources to start a foundation that helps young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds launch their own companies. We never did have that small, intimate wedding I'd originally dreamed of with James. But I'm grateful for that now, because the wedding we did have was a celebration of everything I'd accomplished and everything we were building together. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's about building a life so successful and fulfilling that their opinion of you becomes completely irrelevant. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's about making sure they get a front row seat to watch you succeed.